Okay. So kind of briefly mention this in the calendar, but this month, or really these 2 weeks, are going to be focused on the idea of global public health care and also national public health care. And of course, maybe that name rings a very familiar because of the time that we're in, where the emphasis has been so much on this idea of public health care. And so the way we're going to structure this is that there's a little bit of information just want to throw at you, so you kind of have a basis of understanding for what this is and it's a very broad area, and there's a lot of moving parts when we think about public health care. So what we want you to do is actually be able to dive into a topic that you find interesting. And so it's not like an assignment. It's not like going to be anything crazy. It's going to be like a 5-minute thing. But we'll talk about this, and then we'll get to that part where you actually get the opportunity to learn more about a specific topic. And so that's really where the second next week comes in, when we'll come back and discuss about those. Okay. And don't worry, it's really not an assignment. And I know it sounds like it the way I'm saying it, but I want to emphasize that. So we'll get started about what the heck is global public health care. So I think the most simply put way, think about the health of populations, of the public, right? Public health care, simple enough. But I really like this next definition here, right? Global public health care is the area of study, research, and practice that places a priority on improving the health and achieving equity in the health for all people in the world. Let me let someone else in. And so this idea, can someone, what pops into your head? What concept pops into your head when you think of public health care, either on the national level or the global level? Maybe an event or just anything that comes to mind when you think of public health care. It could be broad or specific. Yeah, go ahead, Priya.
Like pandemics, I guess, like right now.
Yes, huge, huge. And obviously the pandemic has so many moving parts, right? And that's what I want to emphasize about this idea of public health care. Sam, go ahead.
Well, in my mind, that brings like, you mentioned equity. So people that necessarily can't afford a public health care, that can eventually have access to it. Because I know that not everyone in the world can afford it, like, insulin, for example, stuff like that.
Yes, huge. I think especially 2020 and the beginning of obviously this year, the idea of inequity in healthcare has been monumental. And we'll talk about that a little bit more too. And then of course, the pandemic. Anyone else have any thoughts? What terms come to mind when you think about public health care? Can someone name an organization that's involved in public health care, either nationally or globally?
Red Cross.
Red Cross, for sure. That's a good one. Anyone else? You can unmute, raise your, go ahead.
Sorry, the Salvation Army.
Yeah, Salvation Army would definitely count. Yeah.
The World Health Organization?
Yes, that's a huge one. They're a big pillar of the global scene.
UNICEF?
Definitely. I think, within the United Nations, there's a lot of pieces that are very much involved when we think about public health care, including UNICEF major. That's one of the reasons that we, of course, focused on with volunteering last month. I'm glad you brought that one up. Okay, so we'll go on. And here are some, so first, let's look at the left column here. Some very specific ideas that we think about when we talk about issues that are in public health care, right? And those probably all look, or at least most of them, are very familiar to you. Well, in the sense that you know what the word is, and you know what it implies and what it means. By the same token, they're all very different ideas, right? It's not just here's a diagnosis. Of course, HIV/AIDS is an example of one that is, and mental health can also be something where it's, a physician making a diagnosis. But the other ones are factors that are well outside of just the clinical realm. Oh, also obesity, huge obesity epidemic, right? When we talk about public health care. And now I want you to look at the other 13 on the right. These are the 13 most pressing issues in public health care that the World Health Organization explicitly established at the beginning of 2020. And I want you to read over that and realize also that this is the beginning of 2020. So before the pandemic really became a pandemic. So you'll notice that the ideas are there, but the order is also a little bit different. So go ahead and it's actually in reverse order. So what they put as number 1 was the climate crisis. But go ahead, I'll give you 30 seconds to kind of read over that and just think about how these different pieces might affect healthcare and in the health of individuals in your community and also the community in other countries and even across the US as well. So obviously very, very broad. Each individual bullet point there has so many pieces that go into considering what that is. And I think, of course, we can look at epidemic preparedness and ID prevention or infectious disease prevention as things that you'd think would be right at the top of the list at this point in time, right? And I haven't seen the 2021 World Health Organization's release of this, but this was from 2020, so it gives you some perspective. And then I want to bring back to health equity, like Sam said. That is major. I mean, of course, the discourse around racial disparity is monumental in the US right now, and actually across the entire Western world, really. And within healthcare, at the beginning of this year, they released life expectancies in the United States. And on average, the life expectancy in the United States went down 1 year. But what's fascinating when it comes to looking at healthcare equity and really serves as testament to disparity is that the average decrease in life expectancy for white individuals was 0.68 years. For Black and Latino, it was 2 and 3 years, respectively, a decrease in life expectancy. And one thing we should understand about life expectancy is that that's taking a representation of the entire population. So it's not something that's usually very volatile in the sense that it doesn't move up and down very drastically. And so to see that discrepancy is something that I hope kind of amazes you at how serious this question of healthcare disparity is. And I think, over the next 5, 10 years, obviously the next 2 years, 3 years, but continually, the focus on racial disparities is there, but also healthcare disparities will continue to increase. And so I think it's very important when we think about public health now, something that wasn't considered maybe 10 years ago or 5 years ago as heavily as it is now. It's really something big to consider. Okay. So of course, like we said, there are a huge number of organizations when we think about who is on the public healthcare scene. And so for the purpose of what we're going to talk about, we're going to focus on 2. And that is 1 on the global level, World Health Organization, and then 2 on the national level, which is the CDC. Both, I'm sure, are very familiar to you. or at least the CDC is probably familiar to you with that name. And if you've been, watch the news at least a little bit, you probably see that a lot. And understanding what these actors do, and actually that's what we call it in public health care, the individuals and the organizations mostly who are involved in creating public policy, implementing public policy, and also researching public policy within the global healthcare scene, public healthcare scene, are called actors. So we have actors that are governmental organizations, like the CDC, right, affiliated with the US government, but also NGOs, and you might have heard this term, non-governmental organization, like the World Health Organization. Okay, and here's one of my favorite quotes ever. I know I put this as one of the quotes of the week at some point this year, but I really want to emphasize this because now we're talking about public health care. This is a quote by the World Health Organization. It's a definition actually. This is how they define health. So, health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I hope you really take this to heart and think about, when you think about the career of medicine, any career in healthcare, to really appreciate that a patient is a lot more than just the diagnosis that's in their chart. And I think this is just such a fundamental concept, especially, you might know this, that the American Medical Association, and not the American, what am I saying? The AAMC for medical colleges, medical schools, they are becoming more and more focused on this idea of a holistic evaluation of the patient and understanding all the factors that come into play when it comes at looking at the patient's situation and their individual needs outside of just what medication prescription they need to deal with their illness, thinking about what their family conditions are like, thinking about what their socioeconomic status is, thinking about what their housing situation is, all of these factors. And I hope this is the next slide, but this brings me to the concept. All right, we'll get to the slide after that, but social determinants of health. Coming back to the idea of the organizations, before we jump into that, I think sometimes when we think about the US bureaucracy, it's very confusing. Maybe those of you who have taken AP US Gov have some idea or just have some background in this. But within the US government, right, we have the Department of Health and Human Services. And we hear about the FDA, right? Well, can I do a pointer here? Let me see. All right, it's not letting me, but hopefully you can see my mouse. So, right, we hear about the FDA all the time. We hear about the CDC. We just talked about that. We hear about the NIH. That's Fauci's world. And of course, CMS, you might know, which is who's in charge of the Medicare and Medicaid, right? The major insurances, government insurances in the country. Okay, and you might recognize some of these other ones. But just to give you some perspective, that this is the idea, there are a bunch of actors, all just within one, the HHS, Department of Health and Human Services, that are all playing different roles, right? Distinct roles in public health care. Okay. So here comes back to the United Nations, right? So you mentioned UNICEF, right? So overarching, you have the United Nations, and they set out, they say by the year, I can't think, it's 2035, that we are going to aim to achieve these 17 sustainable development goals. And while these are very broad, most of them, almost all of them, are in some way, shape, or form related to global public health care. And so I want you to just take the time to look over this and think about how this can affect an individual, how each of these things could affect an individual, and how different countries deal with different problems differently. And actually different regions in the US too, we have differences. So go ahead and look over these really quick. Or not really quick, take your time. Okay. So, can someone give me an idea? Pick one of these and say how an individual might be affected in terms of their health by one of these. Obviously, maybe not the third one, because that's kind of a given. Yeah, Anushka, go ahead.
Decent work and economic growth could help like bring like food on the table, so that would definitely increase overall health for families.
Yes, for sure. And the inverse is also there. Very good. Sanya?
Zero hunger would obviously like be the same thing as what Anushka said. Like, yeah, starvation and stuff.
Do you pronounce your name Sanya? I've been trying to like figure it out.
No, it's actually Sine, but it's fine.
Sine, sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, Sam?
I see just like a lot of more equality like through a bunch of them, gender equality, like quality of education, and just like equity. Sorry, not quality, equity. I see a lot of equity in some of this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And that really, that's idea of disparity is there too. All of them, very good answers. Okay. So now we'll get to the social determinants of health that I alluded to a little bit prematurely. So when you think about a patient, right, one of the big things that we saw in the case studies that we've done are the section about the social history. And usually the social history meant things like, has this patient smoked before? Has this patient been drinking a lot? What are their living conditions like? Sometimes we touch upon that in the social history. But when we talk about the social determinants of health, it really widens the perspective, right? And so there are 5 really overarching ones. I feel like healthcare is more or less self-explanatory in the idea of access to healthcare in the multitude of ways that exists. But I want you to think about the other 4, right? And this comes back to the same thing. Within each of these, think of one way, again, that it could affect the individual. Why don't we do social and community context and neighborhood environment? We'll put those 2. And give me something from those, because we kind of touch education and economic stability. So think about it, and then raise your hand or unmute and give me an idea of how that can affect an individual, positively or negatively. Yeah, Anvita?
Like neighborhood environment and a social context really helps with your social well-being, so that could really impact your health.
Yeah, definitely. Can you kind of elaborate what you mean by how that could help?
Well, I just feel like it's always good to have like social connections and people who you can rely on to talk to, have fun with, just express yourself, I guess.
Yeah, certainly. I think sometimes, it might sound like simple, but it's something that's so critical. And so that was very good. Yeah, very good elaboration. I'm blanking again.
Sine, it's okay.
Sine. I gotta just say it over and over again and I'll remember it. Sine. Okay, go ahead.
I was gonna say with like the neighborhood and environment thing, it could also be like if it's a violent neighborhood or something, like that could affect like your health.
Yeah, that's very good. And that ties also directly to this question of disparity, right? When we think about certain minority communities that have much more violence, criminal violence present in the community. I mean, being an individual who's affected by that has major implications on physical health, mental health, social health, all of it. That's very good. Sam?
Sorry, my hand was up, but
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead.
like neighborhood and environment, how would, so like, sorry, what was the question?
Yeah, just how the neighborhood and environment or your social community context can positively or negatively affect you as an individual or as someone in another part of the world.
All right, yeah. So like, I feel like if anyone around you is affected positively, it'll in turn, like, I guess, affect you positively as well. Like your community is kind of what holds you up. Like, our Barrington community, and if our Barrington community wasn't as it was now, maybe we might not have been as happy. So community is definitely a big part.
Yes, definitely. I think one thing also to consider is, like you said, if your community has a high socioeconomic level and you're surrounded by that, you have different opportunities that come with that. And I think when we think about if you're surrounded in a community that has a high education level or an education that really prioritizes health, there are communities that the people around you might not trust the healthcare system, might not value the healthcare system. And what do you do about that? Right? That's really the next question. Here we're seeing the issues, seeing the positives and the negatives, but how do we confront the negatives? Right? And that is really this question of the practice of improving the health of populations and the public, especially when we think about social determinants of health that aren't necessarily the fault of an individual, right? Okay. So here's just kind of a brief list to give you some perspective. Like I said, there are a lot of actors that are involved, and that means organization actors. But within organizations, there are people that hold different roles. And that comes down to this question of, are they doing research on public policy? Are they drafting policy to really combat public healthcare issues? And then are they the ones implementing it? Of course, it's much more broad than that. But just to give you some perspective, since our club is based around, healthcare careers and what that means. So take maybe 15, 20 seconds to just skim over this. And you might not recognize all of them, and that's okay. I think one thing that's really important is the second to last one, global health educator. All right, well, that's a very specific term if you're like part of an organization and your role is to go into communities and educate. But think about it in your everyday life, right? The fact that you're sitting here today learning about all these factors that affect health, it makes you a person who is able to educate your community as well, right? And that means your family, your friends, that group. And as a future healthcare professional, you'll know more and you'll be able to educate that your immediate community and continue to do that on an individual level. Maybe you don't go and get an MPH, a master's in public healthcare, but you are able to, in your own proximity, to really teach people about the issues in public healthcare. Like you might know people who don't trust the healthcare system, don't trust vaccines, especially now we have huge vaccine hesitancy, right? And as those of us who strive to pursue the evidence-based healthcare, right, the field of healthcare and medicine, to be an educator in that sense too, and also to remind people that there are disparities in this country, right, and in the world. And I think that's really important to be able to know that you are also an educator in your own individual, person. And I think that's something that, whether we're talking about healthcare or not, is something that's really important. When you think about, you hold your values, you know what you know, and to share that knowledge is very important. So, something to consider. Okay, now the fun part, the research part, but not research in a very traditional sense. So here are 6 major public healthcare emergencies that have occurred in the past 2.5 decades, right? Well, 3 decades. I guess we went back to 1991. And you might recognize some of them. You might not have any idea what the other ones are. I think especially if you don't know what they are, I recommend, choosing this one to end up looking into it. And I'll talk about what that means. You'll notice that 3 of them are viruses. And I think just given the timing, it's really important to understand virology, and not the medicine of it necessarily, not the biochemistry, but rather to appreciate how this idea of an epidemic, this pandemic, is not something new. And I'm sure you all know this, but to understand in the context of, you'll notice SARS, right? What we call the coronavirus that is called SARS-CoV-2, because it is very similar to the SARS, these severe acute respiratory syndrome, that actually I think was in China in 2003. It says something to consider if you're curious about history of viruses. The other 2 I wanted to mention, MRSA is a bacteria. It's related to antibiotic resistance. Very curious thing, very closely related to what we call nosocomial infections, which are infections that are created in a hospital. Being in a hospital environment can result in more likelihood of certain antibiotic resistant infections. And so this is huge, a huge concept now. You'll notice that one of the 13 pillars of the World Health Organization's points was looking at antibiotic resistant strains of bacteria. And MRSA was huge and is huge. The other one I wanted to mention, just so you have an idea, is BSE, or mad cow disease. You might know that word. Obviously, none of these have really occurred in your frame of knowledge, in the sense like when you were kind of probably paying attention to the news, if you have, except the Ebola virus. I'm sure you all know. There were actually in Guinea and Dominican Republic have had outbreaks just recently, just like last week I was reading this, or yesterday. And just something to keep in mind, it's all of this is very, very present. And so to understand these reoccurrent themes in public health care, going into the profession of healthcare, and even just being a functioning human being, to understand that and have that knowledge is so important. Anyway, getting back to what I was saying, mad cow disease is transmitted via prions, and prions are like misfolded proteins. Very interesting, and it's not really well understood. So I think you might find that interesting too, if you've heard of that disease. Okay. So the idea is we have put together a brief, it's like a 1-page sheet. It has 2 questions on it. And we want you to pick one of these 6 events, let's call them, to just go on Wikipedia or go into Google and learn a little bit about them. Really simple. What happened? What's involved? And how was the solution or remedy reached? And those are literally the only 2 questions. And so I'll open that sheet so you all can see it. It's also in Schoology right now. So I want you to go ahead and now look at these. You can work with a partner if you want. So I think you can chat each other in Zoom. You can text each other, whatever. I'm just going to give you we'll do 5 minutes. Let's do 3 minutes. Go into chat. Send me a message with which one of these you're interested in, or if there's another public health issue that you want to look at, you're welcome to do that as well. And so go into chat, send me directly what issue you want to look at, if it's one of these 6 or a different one. And if you want to work with a partner, just mention who your partner is. And so I'll give you 3 to 4 minutes. Let's do that. And go ahead, hit me with it. And then you can feel free to ask questions as we go. And then we'll show you the form that we'll do. It's really brief. Don't worry about it. And I recommend doing something that you don't know. That's always a good plan. and once you send me your event that you want to do, you can go into Schoology and there's a new folder. I think it's in white, and it's called Global Public Healthcare something. And then there's a document in there that you'll want to go ahead and open. I like how you guys are all interested in different things. That's great to see. Okay, perfect. I think that is everyone. Yes. So I have a question. How long does this need to be? So let me open the document right now, and then we'll go over it. Hopefully this works. Okay. So you're all in here. I'm gonna send it in the chat too right now, so you can also see it, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So the basics is first make a copy of this. You can do that, and then very brief. Really, the idea is this isn't supposed to be an assignment. This is not a class. I'm not here to throw work at you. It's really just for your own interest to really look into something that's interesting, and then next week we'll have you kind of share what you learned about your particular global public healthcare event. And so it'll be very brief. It's not like anxiety invoking, I hope. It's not like giving an English presentation. So very brief, go over the summary of the issue, right? So what in the world are we talking about? What are the problems? What's the source of the problem? And what are the results on the individuals in the community that was affected, right? Or the communities, right? And then players or actors involved is what are the organizations that played a role in this? Really, these all should be very easy to find if you just look up the Wikipedia page for your particular healthcare event. And then third thing, how was the problem resolved? And not all of these things have clear resolutions. There have been attempts to reduce the influence of certain bacteria, viruses, so on. you can talk about those. And the ones that have, been resolved per se, you can talk about how, that was accomplished and who was involved in accomplishing it. I think that's really important. One of the big concepts in global public health care and national public health care is this point of collaboration between all of the people that are necessary and all the organizations really that are necessary to accomplish a particular goal, right? To combat this issue. And then, of course, feel free to other points. And so the question I got in the chat was, how long this presentation needs to be? I mean, really, if you're doing 3 sentences for each of these 3 points, that's all we're really asking. Again, it's not supposed to be added work for you guys. This really should take 5-10 minutes, maybe it'll take 10 minutes. And then when you come in, you have 2 options. I want to give you the opportunity. I think one thing that's fun sometimes, if you choose to do it, is you can make a PSA. Do a brief, like 30 seconds, 1 minute, something like that, PSA. If you like making videos, that'd be really cool if you wanted to do that. Or this is what I would do is just answer the questions, right? And then give that information to us. And you can make a slide set if you want. You don't have to. You can just come in next Tuesday, which is the 9th, and really hit us with the information. The idea is that you are now, to some degree, well-informed about this particular topic that you're going to research. And you're going to teach us, right? I don't know everything about all these topics. And so that's where it comes down to, you're going to come and present this information as you wrote it down. You don't need to go crazy. Just be there to communicate what you've learned. And that's what the goal is, right? The problem with just lecturing about public health care is that it's so diverse, right? Like if you look at each of these events, there's so many little pieces that make them differ dramatically. And so that's where doing this is how we're approaching it. And so you guys get to actually research on your own and learn a little about it and then teach us, right? Learn about it and then teach us. So does anyone have any questions about the idea, how we're going to approach this, or anything like that? And make sure you wrote down your what you sent me in the chat. You can scroll up and see it if you need it. Which particular public health care event? So questions. Okay. So really when you end up on Tuesday, when we come and talk, it'll be maybe 3 minutes, 2 minutes, or less for you to kind of just give the spiel about what you learned from researching the topic, or what you and your partner learned in the case of groups. Okay. So if anyone has any trouble accessing it, let me know. This document, because this is what you'll be based off of. And we're going to stick around. We're going, I'll stick around until about 5. And so you're welcome to stay. If you want to talk about anything in healthcare, I love talking about public healthcare. I think it's absolutely phenomenal and really interesting because there's so many different pieces. So you're welcome to head off and go finish this. Just please do come on Tuesday with this document kind of put together. And we'll really look forward to seeing you. And I think everyone will look forward to learning about something they probably do not know much about. So stick around if you want to work. I mean, really, if you stay around for the next 5 minutes and just get it done, then you'll have nothing to worry about and on your plate for the next, week for FHP. It seems weird giving you an assignment for FHP. It's not an assignment. But yeah, you're free to go if you want to. Otherwise, stick around. We'll happy to talk, or just stick around and work on your presentation, or really just the document. Okay, that's all I have to say. Ask away if you have any questions too. And we'll chill till 5.